Hi everyone. Last week we covered divisions of the nervous system. And so one thing that you might want to do if you scroll down to the bottom of this page is, or at least down towards the end here, there's about 5 questions which might be good to do as a review for the different divisions of the nervous system, and a couple other ones in there, just looking at what we're going to do next, and that is the anatomy of the spinal cord nerves, nervous tissue, as well as the anatomy of individual neurons, which are the individual cells of the nervous system. So to start with, looking at a spinal cord and the nerves that extend from the spinal cord, we're just going to go through some of the anatomy. I'll label the numbers, and if you want to do this a different way for study purposes, I'll leave that up to you. So pictured here, if I just kind of blow this up a little bit, pictured here in this image is a nerve cell. Sorry, pictured right here is a nerve. And if you looked at some of the nerve sides and the tissues from our lab on Friday, you would have saw, if you looked at a cross section of this, you would have saw bundles of individual neurons. And so there would be millions of neurons bundled into an individual nerve itself, right? And so here's a couple different images of what that might look like. Now, these bundles here are what are called axons, and we're going to look at those specifically as a key feature to all neurons. All right. Okay, so if we go through the anatomy of a nerve and parts of the parts of the spinal cord, so what we have here, this piece that is kind of being identified here, this is A, which represents a spinal nerve, and so these are all spinal nerves all the way down here, right? And then that spinal nerve splits into 2 sections. The back section here that heads off this way, this would be the dorsal root. So what I'm pointing at here is, again, this sort of circle that encompasses the back section of this, and that would be B, the dorsal root, as this is dorsal side, so that refers to your back. And then this piece on the front is your ventral. And I can explain more of that visually in class, but that refers to the front side. So going towards your belly button and dorsal towards your vertebrae. So what's not shown surrounding the spinal cord is your vertebrae. So we've got the dorsal root, and then on the front side, right? So dorsal root going to the back of the spinal cord, and then on the front side, we have the ventral root, C. And this bulge that exists here, we're going to talk about in a second, but that bulge would be the dorsal root ganglion, which is D. And then into the spinal cord itself, just the 2 main areas that we're going to look at, and I have to erase my little thought here, but this sort of butterfly shape of gray tissue is exactly that. It's the gray matter E. And then what we've got out here in the surrounding space where it's a lighter color is our white matter F. And that color is associated, well, I mean, like most tissue, it's all pinkish, various hues of pink because it's flooded with blood. This tissue takes on a gray and white appearance in a cadaver. But they are fundamentally different in terms of the tissue, because what we'll see is that the neurons and the parts of the neurons that make up this region here, which we refer to the white matter, is predominantly myelinated axons, and this myelin, which we'll see, is a fatty tissue, fatty cells, and gives it that whitish appearance in lacking blood flow. Okay, so here you can see kind of the more bird's eye view from the top down with the vertebrae as part of the overall picture. So we can see the front and back, this region here being a vertebra, and the front side of it. And then you can see the spinal cord sandwiched in between those vertebrae. And then, of course, lots of blood vessels, blue for veins, red for arteries, surrounding that, which we can see here on the front side. And again, we see how those nerves extend laterally through gaps in the vertebrae. All right. So make sure you've got, if you want to think of a way to study those, you should have maybe a brief description that goes with each one, just kind of location, where it is, and maybe what it's doing specifically with the electrical signal. What we're going to see is that both the sensory neuron and the motor output are all tied into an individual nerve. Now think about that in terms of it makes sense. And I'll just remind you, if we just go back when we were talking yesterday, or sorry, last week, and we talked about the interconnected functions, where we talked about first we have input, so this is sensory input, then we have integration, and then we have motor output. And so if we think about a region of our nervous system that is picking up a stimulus, maybe something hot on the stove, and that stimulus travels down a nerve to the central spinal cord, well, we would want the motor output to travel to the same location, right? And so whether it's maybe our adrenal gland sitting on top of our kidney, in which maybe detects a stimulus in the blood, and that stimulus travels towards the central nervous system in the spinal cord, which then goes to the brain for integration. We might then want the motor output to travel to the adrenal gland to cause some effect, right? Okay, so just moving along, looking at types of neurons. So down here, we've got the three main types of neurons that we're going to look at. The first one is what we call a bipolar neuron, and that's simply what you can see here. This is referred to as the cell body. So the cell body is where the nucleus of the neuron is and most of its organelles. So you can see the cell body here, right? And what distinguishes the anatomy of each neuron is kind of the location of this cell body. So in this case, this is referred to as an interneuron, and interneurons are found within the central nervous system, all right? And it's bipolar because you can sort of see it has two main connections, and the cell body is connected within the direction of the impulse. In this case of the sensory neuron, we say that it's unipolar. In fact, the cell body sits outside of what are called the dendrites and the axons. And so the electrical impulse passes by the cell body, whereas here the electrical impulse travels right through the cell body. Our last group of neurons that we're going to look at are the motor neurons. So both sensory neurons and motor neurons make up, if you remember, the PNS, the peripheral nervous system. And so in this case, again, you've got these dendrites, which are going to send electrical signals through the cell body, but you've got multiple regions that are coming through the cell body as opposed to just one, right? And then they extend out this region called the axon, and therefore we have a multipolar. Now, these are all part of sort of external to the brain. There's lots more different types of neurons, glial cells, pyramidal cells. These are, we're not even going to talk about these, I just threw them in there as a picture. These are most of the types of neurons found in the brain, and when I should say this, right, just the pyramidal types of neurons found in the brain. all right, and play excitatory stimulation in various regions of the brain. But we're going to focus on just the first three: interneurons, sensory neurons, and motor neurons. So again, we'll go through and look at the anatomy. So I'll just label these A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then we'll put them in on the diagram. And again, if you want to do this a different way to kind of make it a useful strategy for studying, then by all means do. So dendrites, so up at the top, so one way to tell, so two main parts, if you can see in all these pictures, are these tentacles and these arms that stretch out. And these are the two main parts of these neurons, and they're referred to as dendrites and axons. All right, and so dendrites tend to bring the electrical signal towards the cell body. So all of these up here, right, are dendrites, and they're bringing the electrical impulse towards the cell body, all right? And then down here, it's starting here, it's branching off, but it extends all the way down. And one way to tell the difference, but it's extending all the way down, and this is the axon, which we'll call D, right? The axon. And one way to tell the difference is that it has these funny bulbs, right? So these are axon bulbs, which is G in your list over there, axon bulbs. So that's one way to tell the difference between axons and dendrites. Then we got, of course, the nucleus, which is C. And then we have the nucleoplasm or neuroplasm. We'll just call it cytoplasm, fluid of the cell, right? Cytoplasm, where we find all the organelles. And what else do we got in there? The myelin sheath. So right here, remember I was talking about the white matter. And so you can see there's this kind of cell. We can tell it's a cell because there's a little nucleus here, right, as part of that cell. And think of this cell like kind of a crepe that's wrapped around this axon in layers, like just wrapped around like a piggy in a blanket. This myelin is a fatty cell that helps insulate the electrical charge, which we'll see coming up. And you'll notice that there's gaps in between these cells, and those gaps are our last structure there labeled B, and that's the nodes of Ranvier. Nodes of Ranvier. All right, and myelin, which was, I guess, E. Okay, so that's kind of the anatomy of a neuron, and it doesn't matter what neuron you are. So like if we're looking at this one, might be a little bit hard to tell in this picture because you can't see the axon bulbs. So, you know, if we were to identify these as dendrites, then at the top, just to make things simpler, but again, it would depend on where, you know, if we could see these axon bulbs, but the picture doesn't quite show those up. But regardless, an electrical impulse would travel from the dendrites in this interneuron through the cell body and down the axons. Similarly here in the sensory neuron, electrical impulses would pass down the dendrites, bypassing the cell body, and then along the axons. So it's always dendrites to axons. All right. So what I'm going to have you guys do is basically just describe briefly. You can use your textbook, either one, the hard copy or online, and just describe the function of each. I will just briefly describe. A sensory neuron is just that. It is a neuron that is bringing some sort of sensory input towards the central nervous system, right? The interneuron is found within this region of gray matter, and it's going to synapse with your sensory neuron. And in some cases, it will then also synapse with other interneurons that are traveling to the brain, and it will also synapse with motor neurons that are then going to relay the message back out to the effector, which could be a muscle, a gland, something like that, right? So sensory neurons bring the electrical impulse towards the central nervous system. Interneurons integrate the electrical signal either towards the brain or to the motor neuron, which carries the electrical signal to an effector. So if you want to just read through and summarize those briefly, and then I'm going to also get you to summarize the main anatomy of each neuron, dendrite, cell body, axons, myelin sheath, nodes, ranvier, and the axon terminals in your using your textbook as well. All right, that's your homework, and as well maybe tackle these questions. And then this reflex arc we're going to come back to, but I'm going to post a second video which is going to talk about how this electrical signal is generated. So that's the next video, and then we'll recap tomorrow in class.